Critical communication pedagogy, also referred to as CCP, is an important theory to practice. In order to understand CCP, we must first look into its historical context. The movement for progressive education can be traced back to the 1840s and Horace Mann's quote-unquote radical idea that education should be available to everyone, regardless of how wealthy they are, in order to create better citizens. However, it was not until the early 20th century and John Dewey's 1938 writings on education reform that a larger critique of the education system emerged. A more united academic critique of schooling in the United States came in the 1980s with Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire argues that the traditional method of lecturing to students was inherently oppressive and inhumane, positioning the teacher as all-knowing and the student as a blank slate. Freire named this tradition banking education, a method of teaching when a directed positive knowledge is inserted into a student's mind. He contrasted banking education with the humanizing method of problem posing, meaning that lessons were constructed based on the knowledge students already held and what they wanted to know, creating a better understanding of critical pedagogy. For critical communication theorists concerned with social justice, it is important to develop and expand on critical pedagogy. Many pedagogical scholars, such as bell hooks, have focused on the bodies of students and teachers to challenge Freire's notion of inherent oppression. For example, imagine a disabled teacher who is also a woman of color and perhaps students who are white wealthy men in a classroom. Pedagogy scholars felt that such bipolar arguments failed to acknowledge the dynamics of discursive power, whether located in race, gender, sexualized, and so on identities. CCP answers the call for critical pedagogy to not only focus on pedagogy and power, but pedagogy as power, as creative, shifting, unfinished, and constituted through communication. Instructional communication is primarily concerned with how instructors can behave in ways that encourage students to like the teacher, course, and content to increase cognitive learning. It challenges cadet learning and encourages using frameworks such as Bloom's taxonomy. Joe Sprague, a professor of communication studies, explains that scholars have failed to ask the interaction of external forces with more traditional variables in instructional communication. She asks, does the current approach to scholarship have a liberating or a dehumanizing effect on students and teachers? Well, these are the types of questions CCP aims to address. Critical communication pedagogy emerges from the interactions between instructional communication and critical pedagogy, considering what each provides that the other does not. Critical pedagogical perspectives invite instructional communication scholars to situate their inquiry in relation to macro structures, to explore the ways in which racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression spread throughout classrooms. Critical communication pedagogy is not specifically tied to teaching or formal side of instruction. According to theorists Fasten and Wherein, CCP places communication as central to any understanding of what it is we do when we teach and when we learn. Focusing on actual classroom interaction, CCP questions the exercise of power in the classroom and the service of the student control. Additionally, it critiques manifestations of power and privilege, notes the use of communication to secure or resist power, acknowledges the ability of communicative practices to invite change, and allows for spaces of agency and intervention in education and schooling as a formal institutional practice. In sum, CCP is dedicated to the study of communication in instructional contexts to make change in the ways we talk and think about teaching and learning beyond textbooks and lesson plans and into communities beyond the institution.